The entire history of Dutch explored. Hi everyone, I'm Terry and this is Marvelous Videos. It doesn't matter which generation you belong to, if you were asked to name a character from the Predator franchise, the first name that would probably come to mind would be Dutch, the very epitome of masculinity and testosterone. Despite only appearing in one film, Arnold Schwarzenegger's character Major Alan Dutch Schaefer is the heart and soul of the Predator franchise. Undoubtedly, Dutch is one of the strongest, most morally sound characters the franchise has seen. Even though his journey ends in the first film, a video game later reveals tapes, voiced by Arnold himself, that highlight Dutch's journey after the events of the 1987 film, and maybe that wasn't enough for the fans, but it gave them some kind of closure when it came to Dutch's character arc. In this video, we'll explore everything we know about Dutch's history in the Predator and AvP franchises, along with a comic series that features his brother, and why Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't return to this famous franchise. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Now let's begin. Who is Dutch? Backstory and adventures of the heroic soldier from Predator lore. Predator, the science fiction classic of 1987, directed by John McTiernan and written by brothers Jim and John Thomas, is the first installment of the franchise. The film stars Arnold Schwarzenegger as Major Alan Dutch Schaefer. The film begins with Vietnam War veteran Dutch and his rescue team tasked with rescuing a cabinet minister and his assistant who have been missing for quite some time, with the possibility that they've been held captive by rebel guerrillas. Despite Dutch's objections, his Vietnam War buddy CIA officer Al Dillon, played by Carl Weathers, is assigned to accompany Dutch and his team on this mission. As they begin their journey, the team discovers the remains of a helicopter and 3 corpses, which Dutch identifies as Green Berets, and immediately becomes suspicious of Dillon's intentions. But what surprises Dutch is that Green Berets are a highly trained armed force, and the brutality with which they'd been murdered proved that something sinister was lurking in the dense jungle. Things get worse when the team reaches the guerrilla camp and witnesses the execution of a hostage, leading to a high-octane and trigger-happy ambush which results in the death of several rebels. Dutch realizes it's finally time to confront Dillon about his true intentions. The objective was to neutralize the rebels, but after the previous unit assigned to carry out the mission got eliminated, Dillon tricked his friend and uber-cool commando Dutch into accepting the same mission. We did kind of expect better from the Rocky star, didn't we? Dillon reveals that his mission was to stop a planned Soviet-backed invasion and that the CIA sent the Green Berets weeks earlier for the same task, but they never made it back alive. As the team continues their journey, they're followed by an entity using a cloaking device who soon kills one of the members. Dutch and his remaining team members panic when they realize they're all being hunted down by a strange creature, quite possibly not of this world. Although this film was nothing short of a bloodbath, it's essential to note that Dutch had several improvised methods to try and kill the creature, some of which included an elaborate booby trap constructed from the forest itself. The sequence only proves how well trained and able our macho war veteran was. Towards the end, Dutch was one of the only survivors and even made a stand against the Predator, who hunted down his entire team, even though he was outmatched by the end of it and lost most of his equipment. However, a lucky accident led to Dutch being covered in mud, rendering him invisible to the Predator's heat vision. Dutch used this newfound information to his advantage, proceeding to cover himself in mud to hide his thermal signature, and went ahead to confront the Predator one last time. Even though the Predator did fall into some of Dutch's traps, he didn't die, leading to single combat between the Predator and Dutch. This hand-to-hand fight without the help of any weapons is probably one of the greatest duels of its kind in the history of American cinema. However, even though Dutch was undoubtedly strong, he wasn't a match for the more robust Predator and was subjected to a brutal beating. And if we come to think of it, the species known as the Yautja is nature's killing machine, while Dutch was more a protector than a killer. In the end though, Dutch manages to overpower the beast, but the Predator detonates his self-destruct device, leveling everything within a large radius. Despite this, Dutch managed to escape in time and was picked up by a helicopter, although he wasn't out of harm's way, at least not yet. His journey doesn't end here. In fact, this was possibly the beginning of a much larger role in the Predator franchise. After he was rescued, Dutch began suffering adverse health effects similar to radiation sickness from exposure to the explosion of the Predator's self-destruct device. Dutch was hospitalized briefly, but he managed to leave the hospital and then disappeared. He soon became sort of a legend after the incidents that had taken place. He was even known amongst the Yautjas, who were well aware of his valor and might. Some information revealed to the Yautja tribe led to them having a deep respect for Dutch and his achievements, which by extension led them to having a higher regard for the human race in general. Dutch later reappeared in a futuristic Earth in 2025, and stories of his whereabouts had also been discovered, with Dutch talking about his encounters in tape recordings.
It's September 12th, 1987. My name is Major Alan Schaefer, also known as Dutch.
In 1987, Dutch kept recording his experiences with the Yautja species as insurance in case anything happened to him. It turns out that when Dutch escaped from the hospital where he was being treated after the mission, he began an arduous journey back to South America to the site of the encounter, hoping to hear more of the natives' stories, desperately wanting to know more about what killed his entire team. In 1991, he began living under an assumed identity, masquerading as an author, eager to learn more about the Predator. He eventually found some information that matched his own experiences with the creature, which made him realize that these aliens had been coming to Earth to hunt for a while now. This fact was proven by the statements of Anna, the rebel girl whom Dutch had held captive. He also understood that in most of these stories, these alien species loved the heat, a piece of information he knew would be helpful to him at a later point. By 1992, Dutch's health had worsened due to radiation exposure. He also ran into Agent Keyes from the CIA and 2 other agents. They all had a drink together like they were old friends and exchanged stories about aliens and technology. That's when Dutch learned that Keyes was still obsessed with wanting to recover the Yautja technology and that he was only a few steps behind Dutch in learning about the alien hunters. Before leaving, Keyes also warned Dutch to stay out of the jungle because that's where the Predator would get him. It wasn't until 1996 that Dutch set up a private military company dedicated to performing search and rescue operations. The men he recruited were called Haunted Soldiers and were unaware of what they were working towards. They considered Dutch a legend, which is exactly what he needed them to think of him. Dutch was doing precisely what Dylan did to his team years ago. He was using these men as bait in his hunt for alien life. After waiting a long time, the Predator finally arrived and Dutch and his team immediately engaged the alien. However, after an unexpected explosion, the entire team and the beast were all killed, and the only person to survive was Dutch. However, he allowed himself to be counted amongst the dead, but before he did so, he gathered blood samples and all the technology he possibly could and went on to burn everything in sight. In 1997, Dutch returned to the US, but because he had plenty of contraband, he had to travel through Mexico before making his way to Los Angeles when he realized it was the perfect time for a hunt, considering the heat and the gang wars. However, he was a little too late, because a police detective who worked for the LAPD had already caught the Predator and killed him. Do we have any fans of Mr. Harrigan here? Dutch was then captured by the CIA team OWLF, working on investigating otherworldly life forms, and was forced to barter his stolen Yautja technology in return for his bail. They then made a deal to work together to hunt down the Predators. Dutch was officially their consulting advisor. Instead of working for them, he'd work with them. The OWLF and Dutch working together proved beneficial for both of them. Every time a hunt would finish, they'd come back with more alien technology, and the team's funding would also increase significantly. Together they were more potent and more efficient. Dutch had been successfully hunting down Yautjas for almost 20 years now, and was currently in Laos tracking down a female Yautja. However, things didn't go as planned, and he was ready to accept his fate as she pinned him down with razors cutting into his face, knowing that his time was finally coming to an end. Shockingly, the female Yautja decided to show mercy and released him before she escaped. Dutch wondered if this was because she recognized him from the stories amongst their people. Nevertheless, he had been granted another chance, along with his first failed mission in a very long time, which made him question many things. Dutch had reached the age of 78 and was still hunting these alien species, and an encounter with the Yautja left him severely wounded. However, he wasn't going to give in to death that easily, so he agreed to an experimental treatment that would mix his DNA with that of a predator. After this experiment was a success, he returned to service yet again, and the number of alien encounters had only grown and continued to grow. Dutch decided that he'd continue to hunt the hunters and work with anyone who shared the same goal as him for as long as he was alive. He hoped that everyone would rise together and face this species. Alan Schaefer, or Dutch, will go down in history as one of the most intelligent and resourceful leaders, liked and respected by his team and the men who worked for him. Dutch was a formidable opponent in battle and always fought his hardest even when the one he was fighting wasn't human. Nothing deterred him from his goal. You'd think that Dutch was almost invincible after several of his near-death experiences in the first film of the franchise. Predator comic series, the sequel spin-off to the 1987 film, What Happened to Dutch? The narrative from his brother's perspective. In 1989, Dark Horse Comics published a 4-issue limited comic book series which was initially titled Predator, and was officially the first comic in the now widespread Predator comics line. This comic series was originally intended to feature the character of Dutch. However, the lead character of the comic series was ultimately changed to Detective John Schaefer, who was the brother of Dutch from the 1987 film. The comic begins in New York, which is melting under the scorching summer heat, and a secret meeting between two bosses of their respective gangs is broken up by an unknown attacker. Detectives Rash and Schaefer have been ordered to stay out of this mess, but they ignore their orders and look at what's happened as they make their way to the location. They see that everyone present has been massacred, apart from one of the gang leaders, Carr, who manages to escape just before the detectives can question or capture him. The detectives are both reprimanded by their captain for not following some simple orders and are given the warning to stay out of this case at all costs. The captain also lets them know that the feds will be handling this case. However, Rash and Schaefer are not satisfied. These attacks don't stop, as a few days later, something similar occurs at the New York Police Department firing range, and the only person who makes it out alive is the desk clerk, who was also the only unarmed one there. Once again, Rash and Schaefer, aware that this isn't something they should look into, especially after the warning from their captain, but that doesn't stop them. As they enter the investigation scene without authorization, they are stopped by General Phillips of the US Army, who takes them aside, making it very clear that they should not be investigating these killings. The detectives should have listened to him and apologized, but General Phillips made a point of mentioning Dutch, and that Schaefer must drop this case as these killers may be connected to Dutch in some way. Keep in mind that this was the time when Dutch was missing. After this meeting, the detectives return to the scene of the first attack, looking for clues, but Schaefer makes the mistake of heading inside alone and is instantly attacked by the killer. There is absolutely no competition between the two. The second issue begins where we left off, as the killer is a giant figure with a helmet on and manages to kick Schaefer out of the building. But just before that, Schaefer manages to rip the helmet off the face of the killer. As the detectives get to the hospital, they learn that a mysterious metal device has been attached to the back of Schaefer's neck and threatens to cut his carotid artery if it's removed. Schaefer tells Rash to take a vacation with his family for his safety when he realizes that this killer has specifically tagged him. He plans to travel to Central America, following up on information given by his brother Dutch before his disappearance. Now the readers know who the killer is, but we see Schaefer getting closer to realizing precisely what's going on and how these killings link to his missing brother. Schaefer retraces Dutch's steps, leading him to a jungle where he finds a destroyed rebel encampment and a huge blast crater. Soon enough, he's attacked by a predator, which he recognizes as the subject from New York. He barely manages to kill the creature by kicking it over a cliff, impaling it on a branch, and assumes that this is the end of his journey and that the problem was now solved. However, on the way out of the jungle, Schaefer is captured by Schaefer, a drug dealer from New York, who takes Schaefer back to his base and prepares to have him tortured. But then, a group of predators attack his base. Luckily, Schaefer manages to escape the slaughter and returns to the jungle where General Phillips recovers. The third issue of the comic begins in New York, where Rash discovers a fleet of predator ships hovering over the city when he looks through the helmet Schaefer recovered in the first issue. As Rash tries to convince his superiors, he's captured by Phillips's men. He learns that Phillips intends to hand Schaefer over to the aliens because he believes that the aliens are here to settle the score after Dutch killed one of their members in Central America. His hope is that this will convince them to leave Earth in peace. Rash learns where this deal will be made and heads towards it, trying to save Schaefer from being given to the aliens. There he finds Schaefer holding his captors at gunpoint, and the two detectives flee the scene immediately. Schaefer is determined to take down these aliens, so he recruits Carr and his gang members, arming them with heavy weapons taken from the New York police. It's time for one last showdown. They manage to get the Predator's attention as a war breaks out. However, a huge storm suddenly breaks over, signaling the end of the heat wave in the city, and in response, the creatures retreat, departing Earth in their ships. Undoubtedly, this comic was incredibly popular amongst fans and made way for several comics that built the franchise. However, one can't help but wonder how different it would have been if they had stuck to their original decision of having Dutch as the protagonist of this particular story. Speaking of Dutch's life in the latter part, his great-granddaughter, Cy Judge Schaefer, was a psychic who used her abilities to find out the location of the Predator. This all happened in the crossover comics Predator vs. Judge Dredd. You can check out our video of 10 crazy Predator crossovers. We'll leave a link in the description.
You one ugly mother... motherfucker.
Why Arnold never returned as Dutch. The first film ended with Dutch surviving every attack in the 1987 film, so it was only to be expected that this character played by Arnold Schwarzenegger would return in future films, but that wasn't the case, and there were several reasons for this. Although the character has appeared in comics and video games and has been mentioned several times, he never returned the way the fans really wanted him to. During interviews in the 2010s, Arnold was asked about his life and success in Hollywood, and eventually the questions moved towards his absence in the Predator franchise. Arnold's response is a direct attack on the studio and how sometimes they tend to spend less money on hiring the right cast and crew while still wanting to earn a lot of money from the film. He also compares the first Predator movie to the ones that came after and states that they were barely satisfactory and none of them were as good as the first one. Although Arnold was offered a role in Predator 2, he declined because of the money. He went on to make some other great films, including True Lies, Total Recall, Kindergarten Cop, and many more. For the producers, the reason for not having Arnold came down to financial disagreement, but for Arnold, it was all about making good movies and good choices for the franchise. There's no doubt the franchise saw a dip after Arnold walked away from it, and after every Predator film was announced, the fans hoped he would return, but sadly, he never did. As the franchise continues, nothing can really compare to the 1987 original, and the fans may never see Arnold return to this franchise, but Dutch's name might pop up here and there, and maybe that'll be more than enough. There's no doubt that the character of Dutch has been missed for years now, and while the studio could have recast Arnold with someone else and continued Dutch's story, they chose not to. It would have felt wrong seeing someone other than Arnold playing Dutch, who despite only appearing in one film, has become a much loved character and is still remembered after all this time. Schaefer's character was supposed to appear in the film Predators, where he would have been the leader of the Predators in the game Preserve Planet. However, this never did see the light of day. Well, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.